Welcome to this episode of Game of Leadership, the podcast for curious leaders. I'm Paula Eddie Wilcox, and I'm delighted to welcome our guest for the second time, where we're looking at their take on the game and leadership aspect of the podcast. Who knows what we might find out, because we all look at this differently, and it's always so interesting to see what the guests have in store for me when I turn up, because we never plan this in advance. So I hope you're as excited as me. Let's get into it, and I'll see you on the other side. Welcome to this week's episode of Game of Leadership, the podcast for curious leaders. I'm absolutely delighted to be rejoined this week for Sarah's second episode. Sarah Lefevre, welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, you're so welcome. Look, last week we talked about some incredible creativity that is just oozing out of you. I have to say, it's amazing. And you really shared with us what I can only describe as a journey of discovery for yourself in terms of understanding where you came from at school and you know, the fascinating nature walks you talked about with your teacher. Isn't it lovely how just one teacher can have such a big influence on a child? And I think at one point you mentioned about being a sponge. You know, especially at that age, we really are sponges for learning and information. But actually, I think what we don't realise, and I say this as much for myself, Sarah, as we go along, we just don't realise how much we pick up along the way. And I remember a recent discussion with somebody in a team that I work with about, you know, all the things like the if you like, the boxes, if you like, of my career, and how actually I'm on my fourth career, if you look at it like that, because I've just adapted and changed and done different things to your last week, keeping myself entertained and engaged and you know, understanding what I enjoy and what I want to do along the way. So it was really lovely to hear you sharing how you sort of adapted along the way. And I think, you know, for our listeners, that will hopefully give them the confidence that it's okay to do that. You know, I've been a sort of a hotelier. I've been a project manager. I'm still an accredited project manager. Love running projects, and actually transferable skill helps me do so much day to day. And now I'm in my, you know, I say my fourth. I can't remember what the other one was, but anyway, another one along the way. Yes, assistant. There you go. Helping other people be successful was one of them along the way years back. And now here I am in the leadership and the learning and the coaching space. You know, and it's just fascinating to be able to do these things. But what I want to talk to you about today is really your take on game and leadership. Now, we got a flavour for that last week. But what does game of leadership conjure up for Sarah in this scenario?
Well, it's interesting. You should be talking about, you know, children being sponges and sort of picking things up and learning. I think, to me, one of the sort of driving forces for me around using games for learning is a kind of frustration that we, as a society, we accept the idea that children learn through play. And in fact, you know, kindergarten, that it's all learning through play. And as time goes on, we start to not just fall out of love with play, but actually become quite hostile towards it. And to me, it just doesn't make any sense that we can move from a situation whereby we only learn through play and we learn so quickly through play to suddenly that play isn't suitable. Play isn't suitable for learning, and adults should not be enjoying themselves while they're learning. It should be hard work. because we're grown-ups now. And I come across this such a lot because working in the games-based learning space. And certainly as somebody who is self-employed within that space, it's quite a hard sell. And you have that initial hard sell when you're trying to sell games-based learning into an organization where you're actually selling it to the people who hold the purse strings. So you have to do that job of convincing them that games are an appropriate way of creating and facilitating learning within their organization. But actually, it's not the hardest sell, because quite often when you get to the learners themselves, there are two very distinct camps. There are people who really get it and go, oh, this is great, I'm going to be spending the day playing and I'm learning and I'm really enjoying myself and I'm really engaged. And there's people, and at the other end of the spectrum, there are people who actually feel insulted that they're going to be asked to spend a day playing, because I haven't got to the position I'm in this organization by lollygagging and playing. It's been hard work and I'm a grown-up, and you're insulting me by getting me to play kids games. And I just think it's really, really sad, because the analogy I often use is that the biggest explosion of learning in our lives that we'll ever have, and we'll never equal that again, is when we are babies and toddlers. And all of that learning is achieved through play. It's achieved through a process of, let's do this and see what happens. Oh, I've done that. This is what happened. So now I've learned something. And the explosion of learning that happens at that stage, which can be objectively measured by a sort of proliferation of neurons in the brain, is never equaled. And yet we do this thing saying, well, play is not appropriate for adults. But when adults embrace play, you again get a taste of that sort of rate and depth of learning that children enjoy. And I've kind of forgotten your question, which is another.
Oh, no. Yeah, you're absolutely fine, Sarah. You're answering it really, in terms of that take on game and leadership, and you were going into the fact that it's sometimes hard sell, but for others it's almost an easy sell because they get it instantly. And when I think about the workshops and the programs that I deliver, that element of fun, it has to be fun. And actually I talk about my day-to-day work, with the team, talking about it has to be fun, because we spend the majority of our lives at work. If we're not having fun and the humour's gone and everybody's miserable, okay, sort of using the words that we're kind of talking about, play. You all right there?
Sorry, I just managed to unplug myself and knock my glasses off.
Don't worry. When I'm not obviously using the term play with them, but that fun element, just because we're adults and we're delivering a piece of work doesn't mean we can't have fun together doing that. And I've always been obviously appropriate fun in the workplace, but I've always been an advocate for bringing humour and fun into work and into the workshops and all of that kind of thing, because without my sense of humour, I would really struggle. And trust me, over the years I've been in a couple of teams where that's been really hard work, hence why I'm not in those teams anymore. So you can't, as you sort of alluded to last week, you really get to know yourself as you get older. There is definitely a pleasure in gaining experience and understanding what makes us tick and what we enjoy, don't enjoy, and saying, actually, I want a lot more of the enjoy pot, please. And the less enjoy can go away because I'm not interested.
I think I find the concept of fun a little bit problematic, and I'll explain why. So one of the things, talking about sort of like games-based learning being a hard sell, I keep nearly pulling my headphones out here. I think to a certain extent, and this is not to say I don't think that fun in learning is a good idea, But I think another thing that games-based learning often suffers from, it's a slight image problem, I guess, is the idea that what games in learning are about is about fun, it's about engagement. So even people, and I find this even with people who actually work in the space, is that often people think that the only reason that you're using games for learning is to sugar the pill. So there's quite often this idea that what games-based learning is actually about is it's about engagement. So you've got something really dull, I don't know, compliance training, let's say.
Yeah.
Okay, let's make that fun. Let's make it into a game, because otherwise people won't engage with it. And this is really, to me, this is really selling games-based learning short, because
I agree.
I think one of the things that you have quite a lot of difficulty with in terms of the hard sell again is actually establishing games-based learning as a relevant and robust pedagogy, or andragogy really, because we're dealing with adults, as opposed to just something which is being veneered over the top of the learning to make it palatable.
Yeah.
So it's hard because like a lot of worthwhile things, it's complex, I suppose. But I do find that sometimes that what I'm doing is I'm using that as a way to sell stuff in, because that's the language that people understand. Because obviously as a learning professional, you're selling to people who aren't learning professionals, so you shouldn't expect them to understand the language, because otherwise they wouldn't need you. So the domain language, they wouldn't need you if they knew all that stuff. But it does sort of stick in my throat slightly, because I'm thinking to myself, this is about so much more than just letting your people have fun so that they'll actually turn up.
Do you know what? That I'm so glad that you've talked about it in that way, Sarah, because I always sort of think about, programs or whatever, workshops, in terms of levels of engagement. The fun comes with it, if that makes sense. Yeah. For me, it's about the engagement piece, in terms of what's the value, what are we trying to solve here, first of all. Yeah. But secondly, okay, what value are we adding here? How are we going about it, the engagement piece, and at the end of it, how much of this are they going to remember next week when they've gone back to work and the complexities, the pressures, the stress is all piling back on, and the deadlines. How much of what we did today sticks in a week, 2 weeks, 6 weeks, this time? That's how you sort of see the value, and where they're having a different experience in the kinds of learning that you're providing. It really stands out in people's minds. For a lot of people, it's something they've never experienced. It'll be that, well, do you remember that session with Sarah last year? Well, of course I do. It was fascinating. And though we were playing a game, and I thought it was ludicrous that we were playing a game at work, actually I got X, Y, and Z out of it. It was amazing, and I still remember it. So just, I completely get it. And I hope the people listening will be, this will be resonating with them as they're listening to us.
Yeah, yes, definitely. I'm just trying to think of an example now. But
yes, you shared a brilliant one last time. So, yeah, hear about another game that you've kind of created and what it did for people. And in fact, actually, Sarah, what sort of feedback you had afterwards, because that's what we're talking about here, that value afterwards, that people are sort of, as I say, 6 months down the line, they're remembering, and it's had a lasting impact.
Yeah. Well, the game I talked about last week is still a work in progress, so that hasn't actually gone out into the wild. So the only people who've experienced that one are sort of fellow games-based learning professionals. Yes, I have a large store of unfinished projects, but it will definitely get to the light of day. But I've been working on a lot of card-based projects recently. And I was trying to get to something, and it's kind of gone out of my head now. It was a natural progression from what we were talking about before. Silly brain, the way my brain
Don't
works.
worry, don't worry. Just while you're sort of percolating on that thought, I was just thinking about your mycelium sort of fungi game that you were talking about last week. And outside looking in, it's also got a place for improving communication in the business as well, hasn't it? I mean, how amazing would that be? And that just occurred to me as I was thinking about it. It's just fascinating. So many different applications.
Yeah. Oh, I know what it was. So I think the games that I create and what I try to bring through is I really try to recreate that experience that we have as very young children in learning. And that's not to say I want to create a sort of childlike experience, but I think that the fundamentals, as children, we don't need to be told how to learn. And as I said, we have that greatest explosion of learning when we're very young. And we learn some really, really complex things. We learn how to walk. We learn fine and gross motor skills of various kinds. And we learn how to talk, which is the most astounding thing when you think about it. But none of that happens in the wrong way. I mean, with sort of developmental and learning difficulties aside, none of that happens in the wrong way. Children won't generally start to walk on their hands. They won't learn a language that they don't hear spoken. They won't start speaking French when they're brought up in an English-speaking household. It's just not going to happen. But all of that happens through exploration, and that's what I'm trying to sort of bring about with the games that I create. It's not about necessarily delivering a particular learning outcome, because a lot of the games can be adapted, as you say. In the mycelium game, for example, that could be used for a session on organizational culture. It could equally be used for a session on communication, because there's so much inside it. So for me, it's about the process that the learners go through, and it's about getting them in that headspace that they were when they were children, that openness to trying things out, experimenting, but also learning from experimenting. And as adults, that's all expressed in things like, Kolb's cycle and so on and so forth. But actually, it's just very inherent to us all. It's very natural, and play brings that natural learning capability out in people. It unleashes that openness, that willingness to play what if. And to me, that's the most important question that I ever get people to ask themselves and to answer, is that what if. Where I like to get people to with the games that I create is to try and recreate that sort of frame of mind that they were in as children. So that openness to experimentation and learning from experimentation. Obviously, when you've done sort of formal learning training and so on, you recognise that as kind of Kolb's learning cycle and that those kind of theoretical things. But actually, it's very, very natural to all of us. We don't need to necessarily know all those things, and our learners don't know all those things, to go through that process of just asking what if. And to me, that's a really important question that I ask people, and that I get people to ask themselves and to answer. I think it's probably the most important question, because quite often I do a lot of work with innovation and creativity, and that's a prime example of where you're getting people to play with what could be. So quite often also things like continuous improvement, it's the same idea. You're getting people to explore what the current situation is, but also what could be, and trying to get people to open themselves up to possibilities. And that's where play is ideal, because without you can't do, I don't believe you can do something like creativity or continuous improvement without some element of play. Even if it's not recognized as play, that's what it is, because you have to ask people to put themselves in a position of imagining something which doesn't yet exist. And that is play. Whatever way you look at it, that is playful work. So if you can create playful structures which facilitate that, then you've got a head start on everything.
Oh, I love that idea of it being play. It's making me think about scenario planning. You are looking at, okay, so what if this were to happen? What if this were to happen? And thinking about it in terms of play, creativity, it is all of that. Absolutely.
Play.
It's a very different way of looking at things, which I think can be quite helpful for people who don't necessarily enjoy all of the corporate speak that we are conditioned in that corporate environment. Having worked almost 30 years in corporate environment myself, you have all this language that nobody else outside understands, all the jargon, all of the acronyms, all of the billions of different systems that they have, and every organization is different but the same in terms of there's all these complexities that we're dealing with. We forget about the simplest of things. You've just talked about getting people back in playful state, if you like, and seeing things through a different lens, Sarah, which is so healthy in terms of people's development, and helping, open our eyes and minds. I said that earlier, it to what's possible, the art of the possible. I talk about this with my clients. What's possible? Just imagine if you had a magic wand. What the magic wand, which is really lovely, because a lot of people just often stumped by that. You hold that silence, you hold that space for them, give them a couple of minutes, and then thoughts start. Well, actually, now you've said that, and it starts to flow, because we're so conditioned to go from one meeting to the next meeting to the next meeting without having any time to decompress what happened in the meeting we've just had, and then prepare for the next meeting. So we've never got time to reflect. I call it thinking time, if you like. Therefore, a lot of the coaching that I do is providing that thinking space for people. Because when do we ever book an hour into our diary and go, I'm just going to have some thinking time because I've got so much going on? That's a never. That's a hard never. And actually, I'm even guilty of doing that myself, other than building time around coaching and reflection and things like that. In terms of my day-to-day, building thinking time for myself, what I do try to do, I suppose, is shorten meetings so I've got time in between, which I'm quite good at. But does that resonate with you?
Oh, absolutely. It's interesting you should mention the magic wand, because magic is something that I use very regularly. So a lot of my games are around are focused around mechanics around storytelling and so on. And magic is a big theme in that, because it is so useful, particularly in creativity, because take a sort of standard brainstorming session. What will happen is that usually people will come up with ideas, but before they even start, those ideas will be constrained by what they believe is possible. So they'll already be thinking, although they shouldn't be, because the idea is you diverge, you sort of like come up with the craziest ideas you possibly can, and then you converge and go, okay, now out of those, what is possible? But that very rarely happens, because people find it really difficult to give themselves permission to do that. There's various things that stop them. They don't want to appear foolish in front of other people by coming up with something really outlandish. They're constrained by, they go, well, I've had this idea, but I know it won't work because there isn't enough money, or we don't have the right kit, or whatever. So all of those things are there. So quite often magical framing can be really, really helpful in that. You talked about a magic wand. I quite often, I can give you an example of a game that I've created. I'll talk about that in a minute. But one of the things that happens within that game is it creates a world in which magic exists. There are various other things about that world which are somewhat the same as our world, but different as well. But one of the things is that magic definitely exists, and you can use magic in creating new products and technology and so on. So when you come into an ideation session, you can say, well, yeah, magic exists. So whatever you want, you can have it. And so with that in mind, what product would you create to solve this problem? And it gives people that permission to really get out there and come up with create an idea as they like, because it's really, really difficult when you're in that situation to get people to be more creative from a mundane starting point than it is to pull people back in when they've come up with some really, truly creative ideas.
And
so I have.
I was just going to say, therein lies the value of having a skilled facilitator to help open people's minds, give them permission to take that different and come at things from a very different angle than what they're used to.
Yeah. So I have two products that I've been working on recently, and one quick plug here. One's about to go on Kickstarter. And
how very dare you do a plug?
Yeah. So they're both card decks. One, I've been working a lot with cards because I've realised their versatility is absolutely amazing. They're very compact, and yet there are so many different ways in which you can use a card. I mean, it's sort of getting a bit geeky and games designy here, but I get very excited about the fact that, they can be as physical objects. They can be flat or they can be 3D, because you can put them together in various ways. Obviously, you can turn them over, you can hide things, you can reveal things. As I say, games based or sort of games design geeky, but cards are so versatile. So I've been doing a lot of work with those. But the two products that I've been working on recently, one's called the Museum of Impossible Objects. And really that is an exercise in bottom-up world building. I'll explain that slightly. So world building is a technique that's used, it's obviously used in things like films, whereby they build a world in which the story of the film exists. So a good example of that would be the film Minority Report. So before they made Minority Report, there was about 2 years of world building that went on. Things that never even appear in the film, but the writers are aware of that is in that world. So it flavors their writing. The set designers and the production designers are aware of how that world works. So it flavors the design that they do. Bottom-up world building is a specific technique whereby, actually, Minority Report, they did top-down world building where they would build whole political systems and so on. It's really fascinating. Bottom-up world building is a little simpler from a kind of learning perspective, in that what you do is you create artifacts and say, this artifact lives in this world. What does that artifact tell us about that world? So that's how bottom-up world building works. And the Museum of Impossible Objects is an exercise in bottom-up world building. So it is a deck of 52 cards, each of which is an exhibit in a museum. So on one side of the card, there is a picture of the object, and there's a label that explains what the object is. But on the other side, there are 3 or 4 questions, which, as you wander around the museum, these questions kind of pop into your head as you're looking at the exhibit. So, and in terms of the world that is created through the Museum of Impossible Objects, as I mentioned, magic exists. So there are magical objects in the museum. Quite a lot of those have been created by fairies. And when I say fairies, I don't mean, pink, fluffy, Victorian fairies. These are the fairies of the folklore of the British Isles. They're not necessarily friendly towards human beings. They're magical creatures. They're hidden mostly. So there's a lot of fairy technology around. So magic exists, ghosts exist, and when people die, they hang around in this world. So one of the objects, I'll give you a good example of one of the objects, is the ghost jar. Okay. So the ghost jar is a trapping device for trapping ghosts in if you have a nuisance haunting in your house. It's got a little device and it sucks the ghost in. The ghost is captured in there. So the way that the museum can be used is in a number of different ways. So it could be just used simply as a set of storytelling prompts. So there are these magical, weird and wonderful objects which don't exist in the real world. And you can use those as storytelling prompts if you're a writer. But within a learning setting, although they seem quite out there are lots of very sort of prosaic uses. So the ghost jar, for example, if you turn over the card, there are questions on the back, which the ghost jar prompts. And one of them is, what rights, if any, should be accorded to sentient dead? So you then start to think about a world in which this situation exists, whereby ghosts can be a bit of a nuisance, and there is also the facility to lock them up. And you can start to think, in the real world, there are lots of situations where that occurs. So you can start to think about things like crime and punishment, think about who makes the rules and who they make them for. So there's lots of stuff that can be unpacked around the ghost jar, around privilege. And one of the things that, when I've been working with the Museum of Impossible Objects, when I was actually creating a lot of the cards, there was all that business with, Suella Braverman coming up with the idea of shipping migrants off to Rwanda and stuff. And the ghost jar really resonates with this. You've got, oh God, I've unplugged myself again. I do apologise. Waving my arms around. Hang on, I'm going to have to take my headphones off. So one of the things it can be used for is to have these difficult conversations about difficult subjects, but with a layer of fictional remove. So, for example, I've been in situations where I've been delivering diversity and inclusion sessions. And some of those conversations can be really difficult to start because people, as a good example, if you want to talk about white privilege, for example, there's a big wall goes up with some people whereby they're not willing to talk about that because they feel they're being personally attacked, and they get very defensive. I'm not privileged, I came from a poor background, or whatever. So you can't have those conversations. So having a set of tools which put a layer of remove between those conversations and the actual people who are having those conversations. So if you're talking about locking ghosts up in a jar, it's very different from talking about systems which might disadvantage certain people within society. I'm not articulating this very well.
You are, Sarah. I am definitely following you, and it is about helping give teams permission to have those discussions without it being harmful to one another or
without them hurting each other.
Yes.
So that it has a multitude of uses, and I've got another kind of card deck that I've created as well, which was really a very playful experiment for me to actually create. I've been fascinated for quite a long time by conlangs, which are constructed languages. So people have created their own languages with their own alphabet. So a good example of that would be Klingon. So Klingon is a conlang, which was obviously created for Star Trek, but it actually exists. It actually, you can learn Klingon. It's a real language. So obviously J.R.R. Tolkien made up languages for the Lord of the Rings and so on as well. But there's two particular sort of manuscripts or books that really fascinated me, and one of those is the Voynich manuscript, which is, well, the jury's still out on that, where it came from and what it is, but it's never been deciphered. So it has this text in it and these amazing, really weird and wonderful illustrations, and nobody's really been able to work out what it is. And then there's another one which was basically a kind of riff on the Voynich manuscript, which was created by an artist called, I can't remember his first name, but his second name is Seraphin. So it's the Codex Seraphinianus, and it's an absolutely beautiful thing, again with a conlang and weird and wonderful illustrations in it. So I wanted to create a card deck that was a little bit like that. So I wanted to try and create something that was completely without meaning, which sounds a bit weird. So I created this card deck. I used actually a typeface that was taken from the Voynich manuscript. I used AI to create some weird and wonderful illustrations of things that don't exist, and put the two together. And they're all they're within a card deck, and the card deck may be a game. It looks a bit like a game. So there are cards of different colours. They have different backgrounds on a black and white background. They're two-sided. One side just has an image and it has a single black and white dot, but they're all in different places on the different cards. The other side has is coloured, has a square image, has some text on it, has various dots. It's also got other markings on it that look like things you get on card deck games. But when you take this deck into a room, so quite often I use this for ideation and creativity, but I have used it for other things as well. You take it into a room, and the framing of how they're going to play with the cards is the important bit. So to give an example, continuous improvement. Yeah. So you take this deck and you spread it out on the table and you go, this deck was discovered in an archaeological dig. We're not sure what it is. Nobody's managed to decipher it. It might be a game. We don't know. It could be a knowledge base. We don't know what it is. But the latest theory is that it's a system around continuous improvement. So here you are. You've got 2 hours. I want you to work out how this deck works as a system for continuous improvement. So then people start to have theories about, oh, the black and white dots, that's how those work. Or maybe they are indicating the background colour of the card that needs to go next to that card. Oh, the positions of the dots, maybe that indicates the way round the card should be. So people come up with lots and lots of different theories. So it's pure play. Yes. But people are trying to fit that within the framework they've been given, and they come up with theories. And of course, then those theories are applicable to the learning outcome that they're trying to achieve.
Oh, this is so fascinating, Sarah. I mean, it's how we make sense of the world, right?
Yeah.
So, and again, back to toddlers and babies, as we're learning and we're making sense of our world, putting something so alien in front of a team that they've then got to make sense of must be absolutely fascinating to hear what people come up with. And again, it's giving that permission to think differently about things and make sense of things and do things in a way that we absolutely wouldn't do on a day-to-day basis. Well, I have to say, you've absolutely smashed it with the game episode here, Sarah, because we're getting more insight into your fascinating mind, and I do feel like we could talk forever. But what we'll hold on for today. Thank you so much, because we're lucky enough to have you back next week for your final episode, where we're going to find out a little bit less about the games that you do, but a little bit more about Sarah and your pivotal moments that make you who you are today. So heartfelt thanks for sharing what is the most incredible mind with me today and our listeners, and we'll catch up with you again next week.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Game of Leadership, the podcast for curious leaders. I always think the game episode is one of my favourites because we get a real insight to our guests' take on their ideas of how games and leadership fit together. Every one of them is different, and just when I think there isn't another take that we haven't thought of or covered, one of our guests comes up with something totally different and unique. It's really exciting. Look, now it's your turn. See what you think, see what resonated with you most, and as always, I encourage you to reflect on what you've heard and see what that might mean for your leadership moving forwards. I'm Paula Eddy Wilcox, and this is Game of Leadership, the podcast for curious leaders. I really look forward to seeing you all next week. Bye for now.